Hi all. Week 8, we're focusing on native peoples of the Great Basin this week. Also, this video is going to be much shorter than usual because you guys have a midterm this week. So I'm kind of putting maybe more like 30 minutes to 45 minutes for the midterm. So the video is probably going to be more like 30 minutes rather than an hour long. Hope it doesn't disappoint anybody. I'll probably slide through some of the important details and then move forward. In terms of the midterm review, I would like you guys to post questions on a discussion post. So I'll put a discussion board in terms of question. We could do like a group kind of study session that way through the discussion post. And also, I may, again, try to do a Zoom kind of conference where I'm available for questions that you guys might have, and that would be on Monday. If I'm able to get my Luddite ways to be corrected and get that technology integrated, then I will do so. All right, so in terms of geography and environment, the Great Basin is a fascinating area. A lot of us would look at it as dry desert land. And to be honest, it takes a certain person to really kind of appreciate the desert, and not necessarily just its raw beauty, but also the plants and the animal life that come along with it. So if you're looking at this map here on this page, you can actually see these brown patches that include Salt Lake all the way from kind of the Rocky Mountain, the western version of Rocky Mountains, all the way up into Oregon there on the kind of eastern plains of Oregon. And then we get down into the Sierra Nevadas as well. And then if you see the brown that goes all the way down, follows kind of the Sierra Nevadas and cuts across above Lancaster and Palmdale, that's the Tehachapis and the lower Sierra Nevadas, and into Tejon Ranch. And the Tejon Ranch is what I've posted in terms of your videos for the week. Interesting, very current event stuff, and really Native American issues right in our backyard. Now, this is the fascinating part. When we talk about California natives, there's going to be some crossover because, especially here in Tehachapi, they had a Great Basin language grouping. So they spoke kind of in that same Numic language, which is kind of a Udo-Aztecan language. But they also behaved more like California natives in terms of the acorns. So when we talk a lot about the Great Basin peoples and how they loved the pinyon pines and the pine nuts, that is true of the Tehachapi people, the Kawayasu, or as they call themselves, the Nuwa, which is probably the word that I will use going forward. The oak trees and the acorns were just as important, if not more important, than those pinyon nuts. Which is interesting about this group of people, again, was that during some months they would kind of go to the pinyon nuts, and then when other different harvests, it would be the acorn. All right, so sorry about that little interruption. Ultimately, again, the Kwayasu, or the Nuwa people, are kind of a fascinating group as we talk about the Great Basin people. So I may come back to them a little bit when we talk about the California natives as well. And it's because the landscape in these Tehachapi peaks and ranges in the lower Sierras here, all the way, again, kind of, I don't know if you guys are familiar, I'm sure most of you are, with the I-5 going through the Grapevine. That area too would be included in this. And you can kind of see the little brown line going all the way across those peaks in the mountains. Again, language group, yes, the pinyon pines were important. Sagebrush was around. It's a pinyon juniper zone. But Tehachapi itself is more of an acorn oak woodlands rather than pinyon juniper zone. So there's a blend there. These groups of people, again, utilize the Great Basin and the Mojave Desert. from the eastern Sierras, and again, this would include Lake Tahoe all the way up there, Reno, and then going north, um, and then also the Western Rockies. Huge, huge, vast land area, a bunch of mountain ranges. Water tended to be kind of more the issue in terms of how to get it. It was dry and arid, and really fascinating group of people in terms of well adapted to the environment and making use of the environment around you is amazing part of this culture group. Plants, animals, and subsistence. So in terms of what they use to survive, this is a pinyon pine, and this is what this kind of looks like the area actually east of Tehachapi, kind of moving towards the Mojave Desert. Um, and ultimately, you kind of see the sagebrush down below and the pinyon pines. Junipers were also used, and we'll talk more about them when we get into the material culture. Tule. Tule is going to be used in marshlands. They made Tule rafts, actually, in terms of technology. They use Tule as like it's almost like a cordage, and they could use cordage for that too. But again, boat materials is more of what they use the Tule plant for. Cattails. I don't know if we're super familiar with this. I probably should have put a picture. Cattails are interesting. They look like corn dogs. Kind of a weird thing to say, but they're like skinny corn dogs. That's the color of them too, is brown. And ultimately very useful in terms of foodstuffs. They could use almost every part of the cattail. Sedge, deer, and then we get into the kind of the animal products. Deer, mountain sheep, pronghorn antelope, bison, rabbits, hares. Insects were also a big part of the subsistence as well. History. Earliest evidence of occupation is at 12,000 years ago, so that's 10,000 BCE. And really, kind of the breakdown is that there's a desert culture, then there's archaic culture. Archaic cultures are divided into three different zones. Who comes in when, those kinds of things, language groups. We have late farmers, and these groups include the Fremont and the Virgin Anasazi. They farmed corn and kind of that northern southwest region of the or of the Great Basin, and but these groups were actually gone by the time the European settlers showed up. So fascinating again that they had farming and then farming went away. That has to do with either a couple things, right? There's a few reasons for that. One would be climate change, not enough water to feed your crops. Another one simply would be that crops are seen as something that take too much time, and they go back to their hunter-gatherer ways. This has happened in history before. So again, some interesting kind of groups that were no longer they might have been integrated into other groups at that time, but they were no longer there. But they exist, and we have evidence of that in terms of the farming and use of maize. European contact and ethnographic data. Interesting kind of stories out of this. The Utes stole horses from the Spanish down below, and then they would trade them to the plains natives. So a lot of the horse impact is coming up through this kind of area from the desert southwest up, and the Utes are then going to use them kind of to trade with other Paiutes and ultimately go into the northwest, which is also where they have, or in the plateau, which they also have horses there. And then when we get into kind of the plains, the horse becomes a major thing. But you can kind of see the time period. Spanish explorers, 1776. Remember, wild horses would have made their way up probably a little bit earlier than that, but not much earlier. So you have kind of a competition in terms of domesticated horses, wild horses, and what that looks like. Lewis and Clark are going to pass through this area in 1805. And again, this is really going to start paving the way for immigrants and European kind of ancestry to start passing through in terms of settlements. 1843, Fremont passes through and basically does really kind of solidify that almost those roads of how to get through the Rocky Mountain passes and even the Sierras. And this paves the way for the immigrants. The Mormons come through in 1847. And ultimately what happens is you have a ton of. We have to realize that at this time period, natives are not seen as valuable pieces of American culture, right? They're viewed as other. They're viewed as needing culture. They're viewed as untamed, and many of these kind of American groups that are going to come through ultimately do end up massacring and killing a lot of Native Americans in this area, really for no real reason. Um, a lot of times there's stories about natives stealing women and children, and many times these are coming out of revenge killings, basically. A lot of these groups of people, again, if a settlement formed, remember this is a fascinating part. When people come in and they form these settlements, they start to build permanent structures. For people who don't believe in private property, this becomes a huge kind of conundrum. Like, are these people going to leave? You know, we're here to share the land, but this looks more permanent and kind of claiming of land, and that issue really does start to form some major issues. So again, we can say, well, who is the aggressor? Well, if somebody puts up a permanent fort in your backyard, you may be upset about it, and what are you going to do about it, right? And that's kind of where the native and the American kind of mentality really clashed. Um, Wars do begin after that. There's the Paiute Wars that do form. Um, there's kind of one story in your book that the Native Americans were actually able to beat a militia group out of Reno. It's one of the few kind of Native winning of a war story. So again, we see conflict, we see movement into territories, natives being promised land, those treaties being torn up by basically people just moving in. The Mormons, remember, settle in the Salt Lake Valley, and ultimately there's huge clashes because there's lots of Great Basin natives around, mostly Utes and Shoshone. And ultimately, another part of that is going to be that disease starts to affect these groups of people. Because these groups are so spaced out, and when we look at how big the geographical region is, we can see that these groups were very spaced out. But once the Americans start to put these groups into reservations, disease starts to become rampant. And again, we get smallpox, syphilis, all those big kind of measles, all of those ones that really do kill a lot of people off are going to happen after we put them into reservations. Another big thing, when we go through this area, it's probably hard for us to realize what the area would look like prior to Americans coming in. A lot of this area may have been more wooded and had more trees. However, a lot of the forests and trees were cleared, cut down for fence posts and building. And again, the fence posts would have been for kind of cattle grazing. So land cleared. For one reason, you need the natural resource, which is wood, and for the second, it makes better habitat for cattle. The anthropologists that really start to study this area, Kroeber and Lowy, are two very, very famous anthropologists. I suggest, if you guys have any extra time, to read some of their work. Lowy wrote Primitive Culture and some other books, Culture and Ethnography. He wrote The History of Ethnographic Theory. Lowy was pretty prolific in the theoretical orientation stuff. And really, Lowy's not mentioned much in terms of his ethnography work, but he does do some ethnographic work with the Great Basin people. Again, fascinating. I've read a ton of Lowy, and Lowy is basically the theoretical powerhouse that comes about and really, really challenges Morgan's kind of cultural evolution. His primitive society is in direct rebuke of ancient society, right? Or primitive culture, I believe. I read them in my undergrad. But great books, older kind of style written. But these two individuals are very big in the anthropology world. They're out of UC Berkeley. A lot of museums and buildings are named after them there. Julian Stewart, we're going to talk about him more. Cultural ecology and environmental determinism are very, very important when we look at anthropology.